In 1258, a Mongol army under Hulagu Khan surrounded the city of Baghdad, then the intellectual and cultural capital of the Islamic world, home to nearly 1 million people and a library so vast that later chroniclers claim the Tigris River ran black with the ink of its drowned books. Within 2 weeks, the city had fallen. Estimates of the dead range from 90,000 to as many as 200,000 people, and the House of Wisdom, one of the great libraries of the ancient world, was destroyed, along with centuries of accumulated scholarship. The Mongol war machine that accomplished this was not powered by supply wagons or slow-moving kitchens. It was powered by something almost embarrassingly simple. Riders carried strips of raw meat, often horse meat, tucked beneath their saddles, tenderized by hours of pounding as the horse galloped across the steppe, then eaten raw at the end of a long day of riding and killing. No fires, no cooking pots, no delay. Just meat, a horse, and a rider who needed to eat without ever stopping to eat. That single, brutal piece of battlefield efficiency, historians now argue, is one of the strangest ancestors of the hamburger, a sandwich you can buy today for around $4 from a drive-through window in nearly every country on Earth. So how did raw pounded horse meat carried by a 13th century cavalry become the single most eaten sandwich on the planet, the centerpiece of a global industry worth well over $100 billion a year? How did it topple national cuisines, fuel some of the largest corporations in human history, and end up cooked on a flat-top grill in nearly every country on Earth? That was 1258. But the story of the burger does not really begin in Mongolia, and it certainly does not begin in America. It begins almost 600 years later, in the port city of Hamburg, Germany, a place that had nothing to do with hamburgers as we know them today, and everything to do with the name. Long before there was a hamburger, there was simply the idea of chopped meat, and that idea is genuinely ancient. Ground and minced meat dishes appear across nearly every culture with access to livestock, because chopping meat solves a very old and very practical problem. Tough cuts, old animals, and scraps left over from butchering could all be made edible and even palatable if you simply cut them small enough. Archaeologists and food historians point to ancient Rome, where a cookbook attributed to the gourmet Apicius, compiled sometime around the 4th or 5th century, includes recipes for minced meat mixed with pine nuts, pepper, and wine, formed into patties and pan-fried. The Romans did not call it a hamburger. They did not call it anything close. But the basic technique, take tough meat, chop it fine, season it, cook it in a shape you can hold, was already centuries old by the time the Mongols rode across Asia. Ancient Egyptian tomb paintings show meat being processed and preserved in ways that suggest similar practices. And Tartar and Turkic peoples of Central Asia had long traditions of eating raw or lightly cured minced meat, a practice some historians believe the Mongols carried west, and that eventually gave rise to the dish still known today as steak tartare. Now, the exact chain connecting Mongol horsemen to German sailors to American diners is genuinely disputed among historians, and some scholars consider the Mongol origin story more legend than proven fact. But the pattern itself, chopped meat as a practical, portable, low-effort food, shows up again and again across cultures that had no contact with one another at all. Which tells you something important. This was not one invention. It was an idea so useful that it kept getting invented over and over, independently, wherever people needed to eat meat quickly and cheaply. By the time this tradition reached Northern Europe, it had transformed into something recognizably close to what would eventually be called Hamburg steak. German trade routes through the Baltic and North Seas connected Hamburg to Russia, and Russian merchants had long been familiar with a dish very similar to steak tartare, a legacy of centuries of contact, trade, and conflict with Tatar and Mongol-descended peoples along Russia's eastern and southern frontiers. German cooks in the port city of Hamburg adapted this raw minced beef into a cooked version, seasoning chopped beef with onions, salt, and pepper, sometimes an egg, and pan-frying it into a dense, hearty patty. By the 1700s and into the 1800s, Hamburg steak was a well-established feature of the city's cuisine. sturdy, affordable food for sailors and dock workers in one of Europe's busiest ports. Hamburg was not just a city. It was one of the great gateways to the New World. Between the 1840s and the early 1900s, millions of German immigrants passed through the city's docks on their way to America, fleeing economic hardship, failed revolutions, and religious persecution. And many of them carried Hamburg steak with them, not as a recipe written down in a book, but as a memory of home cooking. A working-class dish, cheap and filling, that traveled in their heads and eventually onto American menus. Shipping lines advertising transatlantic passenger routes from Hamburg to New York even listed Hamburg steak on their onboard menus, a small but telling detail that shows the dish was already recognized as distinctly tied to that one city, carried across an ocean in the stomachs and memories of people who were about to become American. Here is where the story takes a turn that surprises most people. For decades, Hamburg steak in America was exactly what it sounds like: a cooked patty of seasoned ground beef, served on a plate with a knife and fork, no bun in sight. It shows up on the menu of Delmonico's, the famous New York restaurant, as early as 1837, listed alongside other European-style dishes for the city's wealthier diners. It was a legitimate, somewhat upscale item, not street food, not fast food, just a beef dish with a German name. The idea of putting that same ground beef patty between two pieces of bread, the innovation that actually created the hamburger as the world now understands it, did not happen in Germany at all. It happened in America, sometime in the second half of the 19th century, and exactly where and by whom remains one of the most fiercely, almost comically contested questions in American culinary history. Multiple towns across the United States claim to be the true birthplace of the hamburger, and nearly every one of them has built a small local industry, a plaque, a festival, sometimes a museum around that claim. Seymour, Wisconsin credits a teenager named Charlie Negreen, who is said to have flattened a meatball between two slices of bread at the 1885 Outagamie County Fair so that customers could walk and eat at the same time. Athens, Texas credits Fletcher Davis, who reportedly served a ground beef sandwich with mustard and a special sauce at his lunch counter in the 1880s, and who some claim later served the same sandwich at the 1894 World's Fair in St. Louis, though the historical paper trail here is thin at best. New Haven, Connecticut credits Louis Lassen, a Danish immigrant who opened Louis's Lunch in 1895, and who, according to family legend, served a broiler-cooked beef patty between two slices of toast to a customer in a hurry, sometime around 1900, a sandwich the restaurant still serves today, on toast, not a bun, exactly as tradition insists it always has been. Whether any single one of these stories is precisely, verifiably true remains genuinely unsettled among food historians. What is not in dispute is the underlying pattern behind all of them. Across late 19th century America, in fairgrounds, lunch counters, and working-class diners, someone, in several places, independently made the same small but transformative decision. Take the German-style chopped beef patty already familiar to millions of immigrants and their children, and put it between bread so a working person could eat it standing up, walking, or riding without ever sitting down to a plate. That decision seems small at the time. It was not. This is the part that tends to catch people off guard, because the sandwich itself was not actually the hard part to invent. The hard part, the thing that turned a regional novelty into a national institution, was trust. In the early 20th century, ground beef in America had a genuinely terrifying reputation. Upton Sinclair's 1896 novel, The Jungle, exposed horrifying conditions inside Chicago's meatpacking industry, describing filth, disease, and outright fraud in vivid, stomach-turning detail. And while Sinclair's primary goal had been to draw sympathy for exploited immigrant workers, what actually shocked the American public was the food safety angle. Readers were less moved by the plight of the workers than they were horrified by what might be ending up in their meat, and the public reaction was swift and severe. Sales of meat products collapsed almost overnight, and within months, the United States Congress passed the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, one of the first major pieces of federal food safety legislation in American history. Ground beef specifically bore the brunt of public suspicion because grinding meat was widely understood, correctly, as an easy way to disguise spoiled or low-quality scraps that would have been obviously rotten if left whole. A hamburger in the public imagination of the early 1920s was not a wholesome working-class meal. It was a plausible way to get food poisoning. Think about that for a second, because it explains the entire next chapter of this story. If the hamburger was going to survive, let alone conquer the world, someone needed to convince an entire skeptical public that ground beef could be clean, consistent, and safe. That someone was a Wichita, Kansas businessman named Walter Anderson, and the company he built in 1921 alongside a promoter and financier named Edgar Waldo Billy Ingram was called White Castle. This is not a small detail in fast food history. This is the actual hinge point on which the entire industry turns. Anderson had already been selling 5-cent hamburgers from a small stand, but Ingram understood something Anderson, a brilliant cook but a reluctant salesman, did not. That the biggest obstacle to selling hamburgers was not taste, it was trust. So White Castle built its entire brand identity, deliberately and cleverly, around the idea of visible cleanliness. The restaurants were small, stark, white-tiled buildings, designed almost like tiny fortresses of hygiene, with white porcelain enamel exteriors, white uniforms for staff, and open kitchens where customers could watch every single hamburger being prepared, from raw meat to finished sandwich, in full public view. Nothing hidden, nothing to hide. The name itself, White Castle, was chosen deliberately for its associations. White for cleanliness and purity, castle for permanence and strength. Ingram went even further, at one point paying a local physician to eat a steady diet of nothing but White Castle hamburgers for a period of time, and then publish the results, positive, unsurprisingly, as informal proof that the food was healthy. It was a marketing stunt dressed up as science, and by modern standards it would raise more than a few eyebrows. But it worked. White Castle expanded rapidly through the 1920s and 1930s, standardizing its 5-cent steam-grilled, onion-topped patties across dozens of cities. And in doing so, it did something no restaurant chain had really done before. It turned the hamburger from a regional curiosity, viewed with real public suspicion, into a trusted, standardized mass-market product available in the exact same form in city after city. This was not just a restaurant chain succeeding. This was the entire concept of a hamburger being rehabilitated in the American mind, one white-tiled building at a time. Here is a detail that most people find strange when they hear it for the first time. Even after White Castle proved hamburgers could be sold at scale, the American hamburger for decades still lived almost entirely in small, independent lunch counters and regional chains, each with its own recipe, its own bun, its own idea of what a proper hamburger should be. There was no single dominant version of the sandwich. That changed because of two brothers, Richard and Maurice McDonald, and a decision they made in San Bernardino, California in 1948 that had almost nothing to do with the taste of the burger itself and everything to do with how it was made. The brothers had been running a fairly typical drive-in restaurant with car hops, a broad menu, and long wait times, and business, while decent, was not what they wanted. So they closed the restaurant entirely for 3 months, retooled it from the ground up, and reopened with something they called the Speedy Service System. They eliminated almost the entire menu, down to a small handful of items: hamburgers, cheeseburgers, French fries, and milkshakes. And they redesigned the kitchen itself like an assembly line, breaking every step of making a burger into a small, repeatable task performed by one specific worker. One person for the grill, one for dressing the buns, one for the fries, one for the register. Speed, consistency, and low prices replaced variety and table service entirely. This was not just a new restaurant, it was Henry Ford's assembly line applied to a hamburger, and it worked spectacularly well. Customers could get a 15-cent hamburger in under 30 seconds. Food that had previously taken minutes now arrived almost instantly. And the McDonald Brothers single restaurant became a minor sensation, drawing curious restaurant owners from across the country who came to Southern California specifically to watch the system in action and copy it for themselves. One of those visitors, in 1954, was a traveling milkshake machine salesman named Ray Kroc, and what happened next changed the trajectory of global food forever. Kroc had been selling the McDonald brothers a piece of equipment called the multi-mixer, a machine capable of making 5 milkshakes simultaneously, and he was stunned to learn that a single hamburger stand in San Bernardino had ordered 8 of them, enough to make 40 milkshakes at once. He flew out to see the restaurant for himself and immediately recognized what the McDonald brothers, for all their operational brilliance, had not fully grasped. That their system was not just a good restaurant, it was a replicable business model that could be franchised across the entire country. Kroc convinced the brothers to let him handle franchising nationally, and by 1955, he had opened his own McDonald's location in Des Plaines, Illinois, using it as the flagship for an aggressive national expansion. Whether every detail of this famous story unfolded exactly the way later corporate legend describes it remains debated among historians, and Kroc's own later account of events, particularly regarding the McDonald brothers themselves, has been criticized by biographers as self-serving. What is not disputed is the outcome. By 1961, Kroc had bought out the McDonald brothers entirely for $2.7 million, roughly the equivalent of around $28 million in today's money, a payout the brothers reportedly viewed as reasonable at the time, but that looked almost absurdly small within just a few years, given what the company was about to become. Kroc was not a chef. He was not even, by most accounts, a particularly talented cook. What he was a relentless systems builder, obsessed with quality control, consistency, and uniformity down to the smallest detail. The precise weight of a beef patty, the exact temperature of the grill, the specific way lettuce should be shredded. Under his leadership, McDonald's exploded from a single Illinois location into hundreds, then thousands of restaurants across the United States through the 1960s and 1970s. And the modern fast food hamburger, standardized, predictable, identical whether you were eating it in California or Ohio, was essentially born. If you are finding this interesting so far, go ahead and hit subscribe, because this channel covers stories exactly like this every single week, tracing the strange, hidden histories behind the everyday things we barely think twice about. And you will not want to miss what is coming in the back half of this one, because the hamburger story is about to leave America entirely and become something far bigger, and in some ways, far darker than a simple sandwich. Because here is the uncomfortable reality underneath the hamburger's global rise, one that the industry has not always been eager to talk about in detail. The hamburger's explosive growth in the second half of the 20th century was tied directly and often destructively to global beef production. And beef production on an industrial scale has an enormous environmental and human cost. As American fast food chains expanded internationally through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, demand for cheap beef surged, and in several Latin American countries, particularly in Central America, that demand became entangled with a genuinely brutal pattern of land use, often referred to by researchers and journalists as the hamburger connection. Vast stretches of tropical rainforest in countries including Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Brazil were cleared, often through slash-and-burn deforestation, to create cattle pasture, some of it feeding into export markets that eventually supplied cheap beef to the United States and other wealthy nations. Environmental researchers in the 1980s estimated that Central America lost roughly 2/3 of its lowland tropical forests in the preceding few decades, a staggering transformation of the region's ecology, driven substantially by cattle ranching expansion. This was not just an environmental story. It was also a story about who bore the cost and who reaped the benefit. Small farmers and indigenous communities were frequently displaced from traditional lands to make way for large-scale cattle operations, while the profits from that beef often flowed to large landowners, multinational corporations, and indirectly to fast food companies thousands of miles away, who rarely had to reckon publicly with where their meat actually came from. The hamburger on a plastic tray in an air-conditioned restaurant and the burning forest that helped produce the beef inside it were connected by a supply chain most consumers never saw and were never encouraged to think about. Fast food companies have since made various sustainability commitments and supply chain reforms in response to decades of criticism from environmental groups, though the scale of global beef demand and the deforestation still linked to cattle ranching in places like the Amazon today remains a serious and ongoing concern among environmental scientists. The hamburger did not just conquer the world's stomachs. In a very real sense, it helped reshape the world's rainforests, and the true cost of that transformation was rarely printed anywhere on the menu. Meanwhile, back in the more purely commercial side of the story, the mid-20th century also saw the rise of genuine competition. And competition is what actually pushed the hamburger from a simple, uniform product into an entire ecosystem of branding, rivalry, and reinvention. Burger King, founded in 1954 in Miami, Florida, originally under the name Instaburger King, built its identity around flame broiling rather than griddle frying its patties, a technical and marketing distinction the company leaned on heavily, and around its Whopper sandwich, introduced in 1957 as a larger, more customizable alternative squarely aimed at adult customers rather than families. Wendy's, founded by Dave Thomas in 1969 in Columbus, Ohio, positioned itself as the more grown-up made-to-order option, famously mocking its rivals' pre-made assembly line approach in one of the most successful advertising campaigns in fast food history. The 1984 "Where's the Beef" commercials, a phrase that became so culturally embedded it was even used by a presidential candidate during that year's election campaign to question a rival's substance. This was not just marketing noise. It was the beginning of the hamburger becoming a genuine battleground of brand identity. Flame-broiled versus griddle-cooked, made-to-order versus assembly line speed, family-friendly versus adult-oriented, each company fighting over which specific version of the same basic sandwich, ground beef between two pieces of bread, represented the authentic American experience. And that battle for authenticity, ironically, was happening over a food whose real origin story ran through German immigrants, Mongol cavalry, and Russian steak tartare, not through any single uniquely American tradition at all. By the time McDonald's opened its first restaurant outside the United States, in Canada, in 1967, followed soon after by locations in countries across Europe, Asia, and eventually Africa, the hamburger had stopped being an American food that happened to be popular elsewhere, and had started becoming something closer to a global cultural symbol in its own right, for better and for worse. When McDonald's opened its first restaurant in Moscow in January of 1990, in the final years of the Soviet Union, more than 30,000 people lined up on opening day, an almost unimaginable queue that became one of the defining images of that era, widely interpreted at the time as a symbol of Western consumer culture finally breaking through the Iron Curtain. When McDonald's opened in Beijing in 1992, it briefly became the single largest McDonald's restaurant in the world by seating capacity, a striking symbol of China's own economic opening. Economists and social scientists took notice of the hamburger's peculiar new role as a kind of global economic yardstick. In 1986, The Economist magazine introduced the Big Mac Index, a semi-serious but genuinely useful economic tool that compares the price of a McDonald's Big Mac across different countries as a rough real-world way of measuring whether a country's currency is overvalued or undervalued relative to the US dollar, based on the economic theory of purchasing power parity. Think about that for a second. A cheeseburger, invented by accident by German immigrants and popularized by a milkshake machine salesman, had become significant enough, standardized enough, and globally recognizable enough that professional economists started using its price as a legitimate tool for international currency analysis. That is not something anyone made up to make a good story. That is a real index, still published regularly today, built entirely around the worldwide price of a hamburger. This globalization did not happen without friction, and in several places it triggered real cultural backlash. In 1999, a French sheep farmer and activist named José Bové became an international news figure after he and a group of fellow farmers partially dismantled a McDonald's restaurant under construction in Millau, France, an act of protest against globalization, industrial food production, and American cultural influence more broadly. Framed by Bové and his supporters as a defense of French agricultural tradition and food culture against what he called malbouffe, a French term roughly translating to bad food or junk food. Bové was convicted and briefly jailed for the incident, but the protests turned him into a genuine folk hero for anti-globalization movements across Europe, and the hamburger, ironically, became not just a food, but a potent political symbol, standing in for an entire debate about American cultural and economic influence on the rest of the world. In India, McDonald's faced an entirely different kind of challenge. One rooted in religious and cultural values rather than anti-globalization politics. Beef is not consumed by a large majority of India's population due to the sacred status of cows in Hinduism. So McDonald's, rather than abandoning the massive Indian market entirely, developed an almost completely re-engineered menu for the country, replacing beef entirely with chicken, lamb, and vegetarian patties, including the Maharaja Mac, built with chicken instead of beef, and introducing dedicated vegetarian kitchen sections within Indian restaurants to avoid any cross-contamination between meat and vegetarian food preparation. A level of menu localization far beyond what the company had needed anywhere else in the world. The hamburger, in other words, did not actually conquer the globe by staying the same everywhere. It conquered the globe by proving itself endlessly adaptable. Chicken instead of beef in India, lamb-based versions in several Muslim-majority countries where pork was never on the menu to begin with, mixed spaghetti on the menu in the Philippines, teriyaki burgers in Japan, and McArabia flatbread sandwiches across the Middle East. This is the part that does not get enough credit in the popular story of the hamburger's rise. It was never really a single rigid product being forced onto the world. It was a flexible format. Ground meat, bread, condiments, endlessly reshaped to fit local tastes, religious restrictions, and regional ingredients, wearing a different face in nearly every country it entered, while keeping the same essential structure underneath. Today, the scale of the global hamburger industry is difficult to fully grasp using ordinary everyday comparisons. McDonald's alone operates roughly 40,000 restaurants across more than 100 countries, and the company has stated that it serves tens of millions of customers globally every single day, a customer base larger than the entire population of many countries. The broader global burger and sandwich fast food market, once you account for Burger King, Wendy's, countless regional and national chains, and an enormous thriving population of independent gourmet burger restaurants, is worth well over $100 billion annually worldwide. And the United States alone consumes an estimated 50 billion hamburgers every single year, a number so large it works out to roughly 154 burgers per person annually for every single man, woman, and child in the country. 154 burgers per person every year. The United States remains the largest beef-producing and beef-consuming nation on Earth by most measures, though Brazil, Argentina, and Australia are also enormous players in the global beef trade that feeds this demand. And global beef production overall now exceeds 60 million metric tons annually, an amount of meat roughly equivalent in weight to more than 6,000 fully loaded aircraft carriers, a genuinely difficult quantity of food to visualize in any ordinary human terms. But here is the detail that tends to catch people off guard. Because the hamburger story is far from finished, and its next chapter has almost nothing to do with cattle ranches at all. Growing concern over the environmental impact of industrial beef production, particularly its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions through methane produced by cattle, alongside its staggering water usage and its continuing role in global deforestation, has driven a genuinely significant wave of innovation aimed at reinventing the hamburger patty itself. This time, without any animal involved whatsoever. Companies including Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, both founded in the early 2010s, have developed plant-based burger patties engineered specifically to replicate the taste, texture, and even the appearance of cooking, browning, and bleeding, using ingredients like pea protein, soy protein, and in Impossible Foods' case, a genetically engineered molecule called heme. The same iron-containing compound that gives real meat much of its characteristic flavor and color, extracted here from genetically modified yeast, rather than from an animal at all. Both companies have secured placement in major fast food chains and grocery stores around the world. And while plant-based meat sales growth has been genuinely uneven since their initial surge in popularity, cooling off notably in the early 2020s after a period of rapid expansion, the underlying research and development race has continued regardless, now extending even further into lab-grown or cultivated meat, real animal muscle tissue grown directly from cells in a laboratory bioreactor, rather than raised, slaughtered, and butchered on a farm at all. In 2020, Singapore became the first country in the world to approve the sale of lab-grown meat for human consumption. And the United States Food and Drug Administration and Department of Agriculture followed with their own approvals for select cultivated meat products in 2023. A sandwich whose entire 600-year history has been fundamentally, inescapably about ground animal muscle tissue is now, quietly and genuinely, on the edge of a future where the meat inside it may never have come from a living, breathing animal at all. Not bad for a food whose earliest known ancestor was raw horse meat pounded flat under a Mongol saddle. So think about the full arc of everything this sandwich has actually been through. It was there in some early form on the tables of ancient Rome, chopped and seasoned and pan-fried by cooks who had never heard of Germany, let alone America. It was there, in an even earlier and far more brutal form, tucked beneath the saddle of a 13th century Mongol horseman riding toward the gates of Baghdad. It was there in the port city of Hamburg, carried across the Baltic by Russian trade and German innovation. And it was there again, packed into the memories and the sea trunks of millions of German immigrants crossing the Atlantic toward a new life in America. It was there at a Wisconsin county fair, at a Texas lunch counter, and at a small Connecticut diner, in 3 separate, disputed, and possibly all true stories about who first put meat between bread. It was there when Upton Sinclair's expose nearly destroyed America's trust in ground beef entirely. And it was there again when a white-tiled building in Wichita, Kansas rebuilt that same trust, tile by tile, brick by brick. It was there when 2 brothers in San Bernardino turned a kitchen into an assembly line. And it was there when a milkshake machine salesman turned that single kitchen into an empire spanning the entire globe. It was there, painfully, in the smoke of burning Central American rainforests, cleared to feed a demand for cheap beef that stretched from ranches thousands of miles away, all the way to a paper wrapper in someone's hand. It was there in a Moscow winter, in a line 30,000 people long, standing as an unlikely symbol of an empire's collapse. And it is there right now, on grills and griddles in nearly every country on this planet, whether it is made from beef, lamb, chicken, plants, or, quite possibly very soon, cells grown in a laboratory bioreactor, with no farm, no pasture, and no animal involved at all. The hamburger was never really just a hamburger. It was Mongol war logistics, German immigration, American industrial ambition, environmental catastrophe, Cold War symbolism, and cutting-edge biotechnology, all pressed flat, cooked hot, and handed to you wrapped in a piece of paper for a few dollars at a drive-through window. Not bad, honestly, for a sandwich most people assume has always just been exactly what it looks like. If any part of this surprised you, and honestly, if you made it all the way through this one, at least one part probably did, Do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we dig up stories exactly like this every single week. The hidden histories buried inside the food, objects, and habits you interact with every single day, without ever really thinking about where they came from. Let me know in the comments which part of the hamburger's history caught you the most off guard, and I will see you in the next one.